The slave trade was the capturing and transporting of Africans by natives to make them do their work for them without choice, usually by force, and using them as slaves. Most Africans were shipped to America. The route the natives took was called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage transported the slaves to the New World. This slave trade went on from the 16th to the 19th century. The main reason this trade started is because the natives were dying out and needed more people to work their land. Around 11 million Africans were involved in this slave trade. The natives took young men as they were seen as the backbone of the family, making the family more vulnerable and less likely to rebel. The people left behind were seniors or disabled, since they hold no significance to the natives. The higher the number of sugar demanded, the higher the number of slaves. After being captured, the slaves had to walk 300 miles in chains and ropes around their necks onto a boat or the port. While on the boat, they were all kept below and under deck. It was very unclean and overcrowded. More than that, around 20% of the slaves died making this trip from their homeland to North and South America. Bringing slaves and the mixing of the diversity of the two groups between ethnics and the slaves made more diseases to come. Things like whooping cough, smallpox, and yellow fever had a big outbreak, killing off both groups. Another reason the Native Americans used the slaves is because they didn't have to pay them and could work them how they wanted to. Slave trade went on for around 400 years. Whenever slaves had offspring, their children were legally the property of their owners, so it was a never-ending cycle. The slave trade also went by other different names: the Atlantic slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, or the Euro-American slave trade.
Slavery in America. Slavery started in 1619 when pioneer the White Lion brought 20 African slaves ashore in British colonies of Jamestown, Virginia. Throughout the 17th and 18th century, people were kidnapped from their homes in Africa. The people were then forced into slavery in American colonies and worked as servants or production of crops like tobacco and cotton. Slaves were forbidden to quit their service to another person and were treated like property. Slaves were punished by whipping, shanking, hanging, bearing, burning, branching, rape, or imprisonment. One big reason why they chose to take Africans was because they have a unique expertise which Europe believed will make colonial ventures successful. Africans knew how to grow and cultivate crops in tropical and semi-tropical climates. After the American Revolution, many colonists, mostly in the North, slavery was unimportant to the agricultural economy. They began to link the oppression of enslaved Africans by the British and to call slavery abolition. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and on January 1, 1863, he made it official that slaves within any state or designated part of a state, a rebellion shall be thenceforward and forever free. But all slaves were not free until the passing of the 13th Amendment in 1865.
The Civil War began 1861 to 1865. The cause: slavery rights, state versus federal rights, territorial expansion, and the election of Abraham Lincoln. This led to a social difference between the North and the South, fighting between slavery and non-slavery states. This led to a conflict in the North of America, fighting over moral issues, causing men to join the military and to work for cheap labor. Looking at the pictures are men fighting for war. The first battle happened 21st July in 1861, which was named Battle of the Bull Run, where 3,000 men died on the first battle. The last battle was then happened in May 13th, 1865, named after the Plunto Ranch, happened in Houston, Texas.
Segregation in America. After the 13th Amendment led to the liberation of slaves, abolitionists argued about what the fate of slaves should be once they were freed. That's when segregation came to be. Segregation is a practice of requiring separate housing, education, and other services for people of color. The first steps towards official segregation came in the form of black codes. Black codes restrict local and state laws that detailed when, where, and how formerly enslaved people can work and how much they got paid. These codes appeared throughout the South as a legal way to put black citizens into indentured servitude, to take voting rights away, and to control where they lived and how they traveled. These codes controlled every aspect of African American lives at this time. Even the legal system was stacked against black citizens, with former Confederate soldiers working as police and judges, making it extremely difficult for African Americans to win court cases and ensuring they're subjected to black code. During the Reconstruction era, local governments as well as the National Democratic Party and President Andrew Johnson obstruct efforts to help black people. Violence was at an all-time high, which made it difficult for African Americans to live regular lives. Black schools and businesses were vandalized and destroyed. Groups of violent whites attacked, tortured, and hung black citizens, especially at night. The most ruthless organization of the Jim Crow era was the Ku Klux Klan, which was born in 1865 Pulaski, Tennessee, as a private club for Confederate veterans. The KKK grew into a secret society terrorizing black communities and seeping through white Southern culture. In 1875, the outgoing Republican-controlled House and Senate passes a civil rights bill outlawing discrimination in schools, churches, and public transportation. Unfortunately, the bill was barely enforced and overturned by the Supreme Court in 1883. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled Plessy v. Ferguson that segregation was constitutional, and the ruling established the idea of separate but equal. The case involved a mixed-race man who was forced to sit in the black designated train car under Louisiana's Separate Car Act. Between 1877 and 1960s, the Jim Crow laws were more than a set of anti-black laws. It was a lifestyle for African Americans across the country. Black people had to live their lives as second-class citizens. Jim Crow was represented as the messed-up legitimization of anti-black racism.
Integration of African American students into the American school system has been a tumultuous battle, having been endured for the sake of equity. The residual effects of segregation in the American school systems are still very much present today, which has led many students to alternative options such as attending an HBCU. A historically black college or university is an institution that was federally chartered before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. When African American students were denied admission into schools based on race, they built their own and asserted community amongst themselves. These historically black colleges and universities went on to produce some of the greatest minds in science, politics, agriculture, and law, including our very own Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. Beginning in 1948, in the case of Scipio versus the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma, Arkansas became the first southern state to desegregate a law school because a black female student had nowhere to attend. This case set the foundation for many more southern law schools to follow suit. In the 1954 case of Brown versus the Board of Education, in which Plessy v. Ferguson was overturned, segregation was deemed unconstitutional and thus illegal. But although segregation was now illegal, the fight for equality was far from over. Not only was Brown v. versus the Board of Education ignored by the lower courts, but also by states and cities in their area. The Supreme Court didn't even know how to implement it right away, so the people were left with a law that had federal authority, but not much more after that. That was until the 1968 Root and Branch Ordinance, in which the Supreme Court crafted a detailed 5-step plan to make sure that Brown v. the Board of Education was implemented and followed as stated. In the 1971 Supreme Court case of Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, the Supreme Court approved interracial busing in North Carolina for schools to keep residential segregation from tying into a segregated school system. But unfortunately, even after this, white Americans were still fighting with everything they had in them to keep their white schools all white schools. Fortunately, however, this didn't prevail, and African Americans were able to rise up through the education system.
The civil rights movement was a struggle for social justice that took place mainly during the 1950s and 1960s for black Americans to gain equal rights under the law in the United States. The Civil War had officially abolished slavery, but it didn't end discrimination against black people. They continued to endure the devastating effects of racism especially in the South. By the mid-20th century, black Americans had more than enough of prejudice and violence against them. They, along with many white Americans, mobilized and began an unprecedented fight for equality that spanned for 2 decades. As we talk about the civil rights era, it is only right to recognize a few of many heroes and heroines who have paved the pathway for social justice and equality among all American citizens. Rosa Parks, at the time of her arrest, was the secretary of the local NAACP chapter, and the previous summer she had attended a workshop for social and economic justice at Tennessee's Highlander Folk School. Her political activism continued throughout her boycott and the rest of her life. Her arrest in 1955 was not premeditated. As she stated, "If I had been paying attention, I wouldn't have gotten on that bus." Parks was sitting in the front row of a middle section of the bus open to African Americans if seats were vacant, after the only white section filled on subsequent stops, and a white man was left standing. The driver demanded that Parks and the 3 others in the row leave their seats. While the other 3 eventually moved, Parks did not. Parks was not the first African American woman to be arrested for refusing to yield her seat on a Montgomery bus. 9 months before Parks was jailed, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin was the first Montgomery bus passenger to be arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger. She was arrested and became one of 4 plaintiffs in Browder versus Gale, which ruled that Montgomery's segregated bus system was unconstitutional. In court, Colvin opposed the segregation law by declaring herself not guilty. The court, however, ruled against her and put her on probation. Despite the light sentence, Colvin could not escape the court's public opinion. The once quiet student was branded a troublemaker by some, and she had to drop out of college. Her reputation also made it harder for her to find a job, nearly impossible. The NAACP briefly considered using Colvin's case to challenge the segregation laws, but they decided against it because of her age. Also, she became pregnant, and they thought the thought of an unwed mother would attract too much negative attention in a public legal battle. In 1955, Mamie Bradley decided to take a long-awaited vacation to Nebraska to visit relatives. She wanted her son to go with her, but her son Emmett was set on joining his cousins and spending the end of the summer in Mississippi. When she put her son on a southbound train, it was the last time she would see him alive. Mamie Bradley is the mother of Emmett Till, a boy who was killed at the accusation of white tears. When her boy was killed, Mamie turned to her strength of her family and faith and realized she would bear the load alone. Horrified by the mutilation of her son's body, yet determined that it would not happen again, Mamie made a stunning decision to have an open casket funeral for her son. Those in the trenches of the civil rights movement realized that they had to move their fight boldly to the front lines. In December of 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a Montgomery City bus and was arrested for violating Alabama's bus segregation laws. Soon after, a 26-year-old minister, Martin Luther King Jr., called for a citywide bus boycott, and thus the civil rights movement was officially born. Dr. Martin Luther King guided peaceful mass demonstrations that the white police force countered with police dogs and fire hoses. Subsequent mass demonstrations in many communities culminated in a march that attracted more than 250,000 protesters to Washington, D.C., where King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in which he envisioned a world where people were no longer divided by race. King's actions helped pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The law ended the legal separation of people by race in public places. The act also banned job discrimination on the basis of color, race, religion, or national origin. He was arrested for acts of civil disobedience and on trumped-up charges, such as when he was jailed in Montgomery, Alabama in 1956 for driving 30 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. He survived an assassination attempt 10 years before his death when Aisosa Ware plunged a 7-inch letter opener into his chest. The tip of the blade came to the rest alongside his aorta, and King underwent hours of delicate emergency surgery. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill that created a federal holiday to honor King. The holiday, first commemorated in 1986, is celebrated on the third Monday in January, close to the civil rights leader's January 15th birthday.
Police brutality is defined as the use of excessive physical assaults or verbal assaults during police procedures, such as detaining or interrogating a suspect. Deadly force is not always excessive force. However, when the deadly force exceeds that necessary to create a safe environment, it is considered police brutality. Police brutality has historically been perpetrated against individuals in lower socioeconomic levels. The great majority of victims that have been subjected to police brutality in the United States are African Americans. Police brutality was very known or very common during the civil rights era when activists would be sprayed down with water hoses and attacked by police dogs. In the early hours of March 3, 1981, a police chase in Los Angeles ended in an incident that would become synonymous to police brutality. The beating of a young man named Rodney King by Los Angeles Police Department members. An amateur video televised nationwide shows King lying on the ground while 3 officers kicked him and struck him repeatedly with their sticks. The Rodney King incident projected the brutal reality of police abuse into living room across the nation, and for a while the problem was front-page news. Political leaders condemned police use of excessive force and appointed special commissions to investigate incidents of brutality. The media extensively covered the issue, calling particular attention to the fact that police abuse was not evenly distributed throughout American society but excessively victimized people of color. Police officers exercise a great deal of control over the lives of people they interact with, and the abuse of this power is particularly horrifying. We place a lot of trust in the police, and the betrayal of that trust should not go unacknowledged or unpursued. Please stop police brutality.
Here we have police brutality in the 2000s. The definition of police brutality is the excessive use of force by law enforcement, and it can be legally defined as a civil rights violation, where law enforcement officers exercise undue or excessive force against a subject. Approximately 1 in 1,000 black people can be expected to be killed by the police. Here we have George Floyd, just one of the many black Americans who have been killed by the police for doing nothing. And here we have his memorial that his community has put together for him to keep his name alive forever. Rest in peace to George Floyd and the others that have passed away due to police brutality. This is a collage of many black Americans killed by the police for doing absolutely nothing other than being judged by their skin tone. People have been getting tired of the police for killing innocent people and have recently started to do mass protestings around the United States. The police and government have been reacting terribly to the police brutality. Even President Trump called black people thugs for protesting and standing up for basic human rights. In this picture, we have policemen killing someone and expecting to get honor and fame. This is truly disgusting and it has to stop. Black Lives Matter.